There's something about this idea that, whenever you're in a group, maybe you are competing versus training together, right? And the idea that like, hey, you don't have to be the best. And in fact, it's better to be in a group where you're not the best because that's where you learn more, right? So there is a sense of there's like a performance culture, or like if I'm with others, I'm always performing versus like this is a place for me to learn and grow and be okay with not being the best.
This week, I'm speaking with a friend, writer, product manager, startup founder, coach, Jason Shen, who has had an incredible career with multiple chapters. I'd probably split it into 3 or 4. He's gone from going to Stanford for college, being a student athlete there, winning an NCAA national men's championship in gymnastics, then becoming a startup founder, building several businesses from the ground up, learning a ton of lessons, going through several hard pivots, including acquisitions, being a product manager at companies like Etsy and Meta, learning loads of lessons there, at various scales of different teams and working on different products like Facebook groups, for example, through to now taking his career into his own hand, being a coach and working with senior leaders and startup founders and sharing a lot of the things that he's learned from his journey, a lot of things he's been able to pattern match from seeing other startup founders. He's gone through Y Combinator, he's had the conversations with Sam Altman and with Paul Graham and a bunch of these guys. So he's had a ton of really valid and extremely impressive experience. So in this part, we're primarily focusing on his career as an athlete, and we'll have subsequent parts where we focus more on the founder and startup operator aspects of his career. But I think they all connect, and you will see shadows of each within each part. So even in this part, we do talk about being a business leader, being a startup operator, but primarily the interchange between the mindset that you develop and cultivate, what it takes to become a student athlete, what it takes to become an NCAA national men's champion, and how you take some of those lessons into business, and the mindset that kind of connects the two. Jason shared a really interesting model that he has of different types of sports and people that play different types of sports and the type of psyches that they develop. And even for me, it was quite enlightening because I shared, some of my experiences. I played American football during university, previously played basketball before that, and I'm currently running and doing a bunch of things. And it was useful to diagnose where some of my mindset and mentality comes from. And you can see why Jason is such a great coach and why he's such a great ally and support to business leaders and founders. So we talk about a ton in this episode. I've already shared a lot, but I think you're going to love this one. If you do love it, you can get the show notes, the transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. And you can find Jason online on Twitter at Jason Shen. He also has a personal website, jasonshen.com. He writes a ton of content, both online there and also on LinkedIn. So you should check that out. We'll have all the links in the description. And one last thing, if you love this, please do share it with a friend, and don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to find other listeners just like you. I think that you have had a really interesting background. In particular, I think sometimes when I talk to people, they say to me, it seems like I've lived several lifetimes or something like that. And I think you are also one of those fellow people that have, lived a few different lifetimes, and some of them for both of us overlap. Mine, I think, actually, yeah, most of our cycles have overlapped. Mine probably less successful in each domain than yours, but
No, come on, don't do that.
But yes, I'd love to. I think we could probably just jam on a bunch of these things. I probably want to start with, you started gymnastics training from when you were like 6. I mean,
Yeah.
competitive from 8. So what was that process like? And what were you thinking at the time? Because I think for a lot of people, maybe you get involved in sports, this could be a uniquely American thing, in which case you can definitely educate me on that. But I can imagine, let's say here, I'm not even sure if you're fully cognizant of the distinction between competing and not competing, or, did you have a particular vision in mind of, this is exactly where I'm trying to go with this thing? And did you have a lot of, mental stuff attached to it? Or was this just, hey, this is something I like doing and it's fun and I want to spend time doing it?
So it's a couple pieces to this. I was a really rambunctious kid. I was diagnosed with ADHD at some point. I was making trouble even in preschool in China. Moved to the United States when I was 3 years old, to join my dad and my mom. We grew up in Boston. My mom was a gymnastics competitor herself in China. And then she sort of majored in like sports physiology. And so she was like teaching at our local university in China, various physical activities. And so when she came to the United States, she like had a cashier job at one point, but then she started teaching gymnastics. I was kind of going crazy in the playgrounds, and she didn't really want me to do gymnastics at first. She felt like it's a tough life. She's thinking about her time in China, injuries can occur. And so she kind of wanted to keep me out. But then she saw me trying to do like a back handspring and like from some kid who was doing gymnastics in school, and I was trying to do it. And she's like, oh my God, this is, if you're going to do it anyway, you might as well do it in a safe place. Plus, it's more affordable when your mom works there. You get a little bit of employee discount, just kind of stick you in a class, right? Like no extra sort off the back. And it was close by. So it checked a lot of boxes. I settled down, right? Like having that physical activity exertion was really good for me. For the first 2 years, I was just playing. I was just having fun. You're six. The thing about gymnastics is that it takes a long time to start doing interesting things. I mean, you can just kind of like jump into the pit and roll around, and that's fun, but you're not really doing gymnastics. You're just kind of playing on a playground effectively. And, it takes time to learn how to play basketball, play football, or, soccer, what have you, all these sports. But, after a while, kids if you can run and kick a ball, you're playing soccer, right? Like kicking is not like that crazy. So with gymnastics, first 2 years was just like, all right, can you learn the basics? Are you even good enough to do this? Do you have the flexibility, the strength to do this? It takes like years to even build up some sense of like air awareness physically. Where are you in space? Knowing all these things, understanding all these things is important. So I didn't start competing till I was 8. And people just go out to competitions and you have these small routines that you put together. And I think for the first year or two, it's like I wasn't anywhere in particular. I was sort of in the mix, like sometimes would place in a meet, most, top 5 or 6, or sometimes even 8 would get a medal on. Maybe I'd get on one event. There are 6 events. I would medal on, or not even medal, but ribbon on one of them, right? Because you'd have like top 3 get a medal, and then like top 8 get like little color ribbons. But I think between the ages of 9 and 10, I started to get a little bit better. And then between 10 and 11, a little bit more. I went back to China at one point over the summer. My mom kind of like put me up with some of I went back to China several times actually. And my mom kind of like hooked me up with some of her old teammates who are now coaches. And I would like train in China and do a lot more like form, execution, basic technique. And so those summers would always like help me get better. And so when I turned 11, though, I participated in a program called Future Stars, which was meant to be talent development. Right now, you understand what it is. You're like, oh, okay. So we've got these sort of top tier folks. We've got the national team. We've got the junior national team. But they wanted to do what they called the junior developmental national team. So that was like 11, 12, 13-year-old kids. And so it was a special program. You had to like learn certain routines and train those. And I ended up placing and getting into this like developmental national team program. So that was sort of like the first sign of like, oh, I'm competing nationally against other kids all across the country. I'm flying to competitions to sort of do that. Now, granted, there aren't that many male gymnasts, right? Like to be the fastest runner in your state is like a big deal, right? But there's just not that many people who are doing gymnastics. So the pool is smaller, but it's still notable that I got the chance to do this. And this was like a special program. You had to like spend time training for this. So again, but it sort of put me in that place where I'm like, oh, I am pretty good. I could do this. And yeah, I'll stop there. But that's sort of like the progression into competitive.
And I want to keep going with that story, but there's 2 other bits that I'm interested in, just thinking about your progression so far. One, like this is obviously one lane where you're finding some very clear competence where the more you do it, the more you're realizing, okay, this is something I'm actually good at. This is something I could pursue meaningfully. And, regardless of the number of other people competing in this sphere, this is something that could be uniquely your own. Were you also doing well, like in school, in other domains? I know you mentioned getting in trouble early on. Was it something that, oh, actually, I'm generally quite competent, or was it like this could be the one thing? And then also, I don't know the extent to which this connects. because you mentioned getting in trouble. I know that for me, so I was also a first generation immigrant. We came from Nigeria. And I think that was also a connection as well. It might be more on the education side, specifically because I remember being ahead when I first came here. And we moved around a lot. You know, you're
How
trying to
old were you
figure
when
out.
you first came?
I was something like 7 or so.
So you'd already done
Um,
some school. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So I'd already started school. And I think that was what was frustrating me because I was learning stuff I'd already learned. And then also, when you're moving around, sometimes they will put you, like I remember we moved from South London or Southeast London to North London. And then they made me sit out the rest of that school year because it was like, oh, you don't want to join a whole new thing in the beginning of this year. Why don't you just join at the beginning of next year? And then the next year that I joined, they were like, oh, and you should also be with your age mates. So now I'm doing for almost the third time this exact same thing that I've learned. And I was just bored. So from that point on, I don't think I barely paid any attention.
Sure,
So I'm
sure.
interested in, like, from your perspective, especially because you're going back and spending that time in China, do you feel like you instantly integrated? Because most of the Asian Americans that I know are actually second generation. Like very few, just again, maybe it's a limited sample bias, but of the ones that I know, most of them are second generation where their parents came. And so they do feel this connection even to each other where it's like, oh, we're all growing up here. Like I was born here. This is my life. But because you didn't, and then you're still going back, do you feel like there was some outsider or misfit energy there as well?
Yeah, it was like it's like a half step. You know, I wasn't born in the United States, and I was very clear that, you know, even with a lot of these things, it would be like, oh, you're on this national program, but technically you're not, or like if you they started to become more aware of that, and they'd have like little stars next to your name to kind of indicate like, okay, but if somebody else is behind you and they would qualify in the national team, like they'll get it before you, you know, because you're not technically a citizen. So that was something that was made aware for me. But on the other hand, I don't really have a lot of memories of China as a kid, as a 3 year old. You know, that just wasn't really available to me. But going back certainly kind of like reintegrated me into Chinese sort of culture to some degree. You know, I think even being 7 or being 10, like it's different. And then some people who like, I have a client who lived in Asia until college, you know, and so it's like 10 years later, she still doesn't feel like she's American, even though she's been in the country for quite some time as an adult. So yeah, I think I was somewhere in the middle in terms of that. In terms of my whether I was good at other things, I did reasonably well in school. We grew up in a suburb. You know, my parents fought really hard to try to be in a suburb that was considered investing in their school systems. So I went to public schools, but they were reasonably good public schools, and I never understood why it was such a big deal that my dad was always talking about public school versus private school. And then it was like, oh, in a lot of other places, like people just go to private school because the public schools aren't that good, depending on where you're coming from. So for me, I went to public school and I was like in some of the early, you know, advanced math classes, but I struggled in some of the other areas. At one point, we were even talking about me skipping a grade, but they felt that my social skills were not quite there and that would be where I would suffer. And whenever I told people that, I would put social skills in quotes and everyone would laugh. And I now realize it's like that proves your point, right? That you're dismissing this thing that like really is important. So yeah, I did reasonably well in school. There was some pressure. Like I wouldn't call my parents like full on tiger parents, but they certainly had high expectations for me and had sometimes extra work for me, or over the summer they like really wanted to make sure I was like still like engaging in educational activities, and so worksheets and booklets and all that stuff. So yeah, academics was really good. I also like sang in chorus, you know, I started playing the violin, and I was doing karate for a couple of years. But you know, in that 10-11 time frame is when I started to like narrow in and say, you know what, like gymnastics seemed to be my thing. Dropped out of the chorus. I think I was still playing violin, but like less seriously. You just didn't have time with all the classes, and you're ramping up your training, right? Like you're going to the gym maybe like 3 times a week for 2 hours, and then it's like 4 times a week, 5 times a week, 6 times a week. So Monday, Tuesday through Saturday, and so Sunday off. And so by the time I was like 12 or 13, I was doing like 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, you know, like 3.5, you know, so it's like 20 to 24 hours a week. That's a lot of time in the gym, but that's sort of what it takes to kind of refine your skill and be able to perform at a high level and perform safely.
Was there anything in particular that you found difficult about it? Because I mean, this is me as an outsider. When I look at gymnasts and some of the things they do, it looks incredible. And I mean, you get incredibly strong, you become incredibly flexible. Does it ladder up intuitively in terms of, okay, if you get your flexibility right and you learn these basic things, then you can then do these things? Or does it still feel like there are certain things where there's actually a step function in difficulty? Because it's very easy, everyone sitting at home watching Simone Biles or watching, some of these people. I forget the guy's name, but the guy that had the glasses that was doing the
Stephen
the
Neurotic,
force.
yeah.
Yes, yes. And, there's a sense in which you can watch it looking at from home, and the amount of perceived difficulty there is to, oh, what is that actually like when you're there in the moment?
The idea is that you try to make it feel effortless, right? And there's no one else affecting you. One of the things gymnastics kind of instills in you is that like it's on you, you're in control, it's about sort of like how you feel as you're doing the movement. Unlike other sports where you have to like react to what your opponent or the other team or whoever is doing something, right? So it's not totally just whatever you want to do. For me, I think it was a couple things. I had great flexibility naturally. Strength was important to me. To get stronger, you have to do a lot of conditioning. Conditioning is annoying and painful and kind of boring. So didn't feel like doing a lot of it. You have to have good technique. And this is often where my mom harped because she felt like the coaches that I was working with often didn't have the strongest grasp of the best technique. And so they were kind of getting you to learn the skill, but you're not learning it with the best form. I mean, I think when we look at basketball, for instance, like there's a lot made of Steph Curry's like arm angle and like how high his shoulder lifts and all of these things and how he sort of like does it the same way every single time. Consistency. So technique, consistency. And then I said form already, but there's also the form of like pointing your toes, straightening your legs, opening your shoulder 100%, hitting top, the handstand position. So that's where you see all these like tiny little deductions. Like that looked perfect. Well, it's like, well, but he split his foot a little bit on that one move and he didn't quite get to the handstand. He got like 5 degrees past handstand. So those are all little marks that come out, as you get higher and higher. And so like at early on, the form doesn't matter so much, but the further up you go, the more they're looking for those tiny little deductions. And so, yeah, I think I struggled with the strength aspect of it. At one point, I switched gyms and I switched to a new gym because our boys program had moved, and my mom used that opportunity to like look around for new, because it's like it's not just the one that's right near our house anymore, right? So why don't we look around? And I ended up working with this other gym with an Armenian coach who had come from Armenia, where he's on the national team. He was in Brazil for a number of years, coached there, and then he had moved to the United States. 32, like pretty young, still quite active, pretty short guy. His name was Levon Karakanyan, and he actually coached Frederick Richards, one of the other men's team members who, was on the team in Paris. So that's phenomenal for him. He is now Olympic trained Olympians who have competed. But, I was in the first or second year that he was in the country. And so he was very intense, very on your ass, great form, lots of focus on strength. I got leaps and bounds better in that year as my sophomore year in high school. So that was, an example of where like the right coach who puts the right program in place can really put a leap into your development.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave, fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. So to my understanding, you go to Stanford as a gymnast, you're on this team. First of all, that by itself, very incredible. But then a few more things. One, eventually winning a championship, although you didn't actually get to participate in the final of that. And so I'm really interested to, there's a lot of emotional nuance in that specifically of, okay, you manage to be on a championship team, you win this title, but you specifically don't get to feel everything that goes into it, even though you were there on the journey. And then the other part, also getting, I think, 2 world records, which is pretty incredible as well along the way. So yeah, like tell me which parts stand out the most as like these are the really important points along that journey.
Yeah, so obviously there's so much to go into, and we have lots of topics to cover. So I'll say a few
Yeah.
things. First of all, I don't think I would have gotten into Stanford without the gymnastics success. Not only just because, oh, it's a demonstrated ability, but it's like the sports program. We now see more and more how legacies, dean's lists, and athletes get special treatment in getting into these programs. And so I was recruited to multiple schools. All the other schools were like, yeah, if you want to come here, you're in. It's just a formality of that. You just have to commit to us and we'll give you this much scholarship. Stanford's the only one that actually made you apply. So there was still like a bar that you had to hit. But I think it was relaxed for those athletes. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to have used my athletic ability to get there into Stanford. And I know I'm a smart person, but there were a ton of like really, really smart people at Stanford that you're like, damn, if I didn't have this going for me, I don't know if I've been able to cut it. Being part of a team, up until then, I was only an individual competitor. Yes, you had other guys that you trained with in your gym, but you compete with them. You still are sort of like going head to head with them. In college gymnastics, you're mostly focused on the team performance. Yeah, there are some all around sort of like records and things like that, but that was like secondary, And so learning to be part of a team, doing team bonding activities, going to camping, all these things. Like, I think I learned a lot about how to act in a masculine sort of male testosterone culture from sports. And, up until then, being Asian American, I had some groups of guys that I was part of, but we didn't have that kind of like backslapping bro, nut sack tapping culture that like a certain kind of Western male American culture has. And that was important for me, even though, there was a lot that I struggled with as well in that. And then the last thing I'll say is, yes, I injured my knee in a sort of very severe injury in my junior year. I was out for dislocated my knee, tore all 4 ligaments, had multiple reconstructive surgeries, unclear if I would return to competition. Eventually did, but only on the pommel horse and the parallel bars. Re-injured my knee going into the sort of week before the finals. So I was actually out. I mean, I would have been on like 1 or 2 events had I stayed in, and I would have been the first guy up, which means that like you're really setting the bar for the following guys to do better scores than you. But yeah, it was bittersweet to win. I wouldn't have been able to be part of that team if I hadn't injured myself, because you get an extra year. It was also a year where I got to start a nonprofit with a number of folks at Stanford that I still stay in touch with that have all gone on to do really interesting things. So it's like a lesson in resilience, a big one. Like, things can be taken away from you very quickly. I never did another vault again. I never did another high bar dismount that I loved again. That was it. It was over in an instant. The recovery I was sort of earned the respect of my teammates in a way that I hadn't had before, because they saw me dedicate myself to the recovery and to support them throughout my own time, even when I wasn't competing. And it opened the door for other things for me to do that I wouldn't have had time to do had I been only in the gym all the time. So you sort of learn all of these things, and you have to recognize that like you have to appreciate what you have. You don't know when you lose it. And I see this in other people. They don't necessarily, my clients, people in my family, if you don't have that kind of experience, it's easy to take things for granted or be frustrated. Like, why can't I get this next thing? Or like, it's unfair. It's like, yo, you don't know, like it can just be over, right? And sports in particular has that thing going for you. And yet when you have something difficult happen to you, it can open doors to a lot of other possibilities.
Yeah, would love to know what you learned both from the injury and then also from, I guess, sports in general, at least in the context that you did it. Because, I mean, again, I'm not a gymnast specifically, but it's a bit weird in that it's a kind of a team sport, also kind of not a team sport, at least when you're on there, because
Yep.
from what I see, usually you're on there by yourself. Whereas
Yep.
I played football early on, like soccer, then basketball, and then American football. And so, there's a lot that I might have learned from playing American football.
When did you play
team.
American football? In college?
Yeah, university, and also after university as well. Yeah,
That's interesting. Like a recreational football league is not something I hear as much about, right? Because of the injury and just like no players you need to field to like play. But that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think
Mm.
my year was the first year we had a proper team. So we got the beginning of it. And yeah, it was a great experience. But I think, okay, two more connections to your story. One, I think we were both captains, at least, well, me for my second year and you in your final year. And then the other thing is that I also had an injury. And I think this is
Mhm.
why I was specifically asking you about your injury, because I don't know if you'd been injured before you had the knee injury, but I had
Some
never
injuries,
had,
but yeah, nothing so
okay, I'd
serious. Yeah.
never had a serious injury before.
Mm.
And genuinely, I cannot explain to you, I did not take it very well. And it's a bit shameful in retrospect, but it was seriously depressing to me. Like,
Yeah.
I think in my head, the self image that I had was, and especially American football, you know, it's quite rough. You run around, you hit
Yeah.
people, and I played defense. I was a cornerback. So this idea that I can just do stuff, and it had just never happened. I just could not, you know, this
I'm
idea
strong.
that
I'm
like,
powerful as a default.
yeah,
That's just it.
I just cannot play. And I had GB trials, which I then couldn't go to. GB as in like for the Great
Mm.
Britain like a university level team,
Yeah.
and I just couldn't go. And I had this cast on my leg. I'd never had a cast before. First, I had a plaster cast, and then they changed it to an air cast. And because it's a plaster cast, I lived at the time. I was renting this tiny little place with a friend, and it was like above a chicken shop. So it's upstairs,
Mm.
and it was raining a lot. And the entryway to get up there is outside. So basically, I could barely leave the flat because of the rain. Like, I can't get this thing
Mm.
wet.
Yeah. It's
So
dangerous.
I
Yeah.
was just inside, and it was just such a miserable time. And I don't think I responded well at all. It wasn't like, oh, I just bounced back and I was like, oh, I can't wait till I get back out there and, you know, whatever. I was just a mess. So I'm interested to know from your perspective what that was like for you. And then also, I guess, within the context generally, very often people say, oh, you know, if you play team sports, translates very well to success in work or in business. And there's loads of lessons that you can learn.
So injury wise, yes, it's one of the reasons why I think sports is important as a developmental thing for kids is like you learn that you can't win all the time, that you do lose, and injuries can happen, other things can happen. Stuff is not always in your control, and it's very clear when someone's like way better than you. You're just like, okay, they're really good, right? And that's an important lesson to learn. For me, the injury, because I'd had other injuries I knew, and I had teammates who had shoulder surgery even in high school. So I could consider myself quite lucky that I'd never had a serious injury that required surgery. So when I actually did injure my knee, I was like, oh, this is my time. This is when it was going to happen. Like this, I've been lucky up until this point, and now the bullet did hit me. And I was 100% committed to coming back. I sort of, I don't know, watched enough sports movies or like experienced enough of that where it's like, okay, I was immediately like, all right, I'm on the comeback train now. And like people are going to say stuff, and this is going to be like the inspirational lifetime movie that they're going to play about my life later. So I really went in with that mentality. And to some degree, I was a little bit too gung ho. I did some stuff that like probably wasn't great for me. I like did a charity walk and in my knee brace and like sweated into my stitches and then like got infected. And, that probably set my, return back by some time. So for me, I don't know. I was already kind of like in the mindset of like bad things can happen. And when you do, you have to really like work to like recover from it. So that was my mindset. And I know that that's not everybody's mindset, but that helped me a lot. But it is a risk for athletes to get depressed. That's definitely a thing that can happen and does happen, especially if it's chronic and they never sort of get to quite the same place. But it's sort of like not a clean break. Like I have a video of it, it's like very clear, like something happened. So that's what I'll say on the injuries front. On the sports front, I have this theory that there are sort of 4 types of sports, but really kind of like 3 major ones. It's side by side versus head to head, and then team versus individual. So side by side versus head to head, like weightlifting is like gymnastics. There's no other person. Everybody goes up, and there's maybe some minor strategy around like how many weights you're going to do because they did this or whatever. But you're just going up and lifting as much weight as possible. Pole vault, shot put, all, a lot of the track things. Then you got like running where there's like a little bit of strategy on like when you're going to pace. So there's sort of like, it's a spectrum. It's not like a clean cut. So that's all sort of side by side. Then you've got head to head, the boxing, tennis, wrestling. There's like you and another person. And it's like very explicitly clear. Fencing, where the you are facing off somebody else. And now it's about strengths and weaknesses and like avoiding your weaknesses, hitting their strengths, and like adapting to what's going on and changing strategies midway through the competition to sort of respond to things. So there's like certain things you get from that. And then there's, of course, team sports. And so most team sports are head to head. You're playing soccer against another team. And so the ball. And so now it's about team cohesion and like how much you have your own personal strategy. It almost sometimes it matters what they're doing, but to some degree, it's also like, can you just execute your own strategy really well and not devolve into like who's supposed to have the ball and you're not doing the right thing? And like if you can just crisply execute your own play, kind of like doesn't really matter until it does. Well, you got synchronized swimming. Like I can't think of too many other sports that are like you do a thing as a group and then they do a thing as a group. Cheerleading, maybe, I don't know, like something like that, right? But with individual side by side, it's really just about you and you feel like you're in total control. You almost teach yourself to ignore what other people are doing. It doesn't matter what they're doing because they don't affect you. Now, in the business world, like what other people are doing does affect you. And it's not to say you should get overwhelmed by that and get too focused on the competition, but like you exist in an ecosystem of the other players and you need to understand that. Like, how are you going to fit into that existing system? You're not just a floating entity, right? And you also don't really have to adapt to other people. It's just about you. Again, like when things change, you have to change with it. And so I think there's a lot that I learned about stepping up when you are afraid, the importance of doing the sort of behind the scenes work to kind of be able to perform at a high level, a lot of practice and training, and like the idea that coaching is valuable. And like having someone who can even see what you're doing and tell you what you're doing. Your head is out here. It doesn't feel like it's out, but it is out. Watch the videotape. Your head's out. So there was a lot of that. And like, even when you think you can't do it, you can do it at times. Like we had one of the things Levon would do is at the end of long workouts, he'd have us do what he called max circles, or we had to do at least 73, and in a typical pommel horse competition, you only have to do 30, but you're also doing these complex maneuvers. So it's harder than just doing 30 circles. But we'd have to do 73. That was his number. And sometimes you'd be really tired. But if you missed it, you'd have to start over and do it again. So you're like, I really want to do it on the first try. And you like play all these mind games with yourself to psych yourself into doing it. And you're like, okay, 40, it's like easy, 50, like you're just trying to bring yourself to it. And there are times where I was so exhausted and yet I was able to do it. And that teaches you something like, wow, if you can really dial it in and bring it, even when you are sort of dead tired and beat, you can still rally. And that's really powerful. So I think I apply a lot of those into my work as a founder and now as a coach. But there were also some things that kind of held me back, the idea of not adapting, of looking at the competition. And sometimes in business, the way is to kind of like hack the system and to kind of cheat, right? And cheat using, I use loosely, like you can sort of shortcut things. There's this great advertisement that when Tommy Hilfiger was coming out and this guy made an ad that was like the 5 most important men's designers. And it was like Ralph Lauren, like Calvin Klein. And he had like little blanks. And so it was like you had to like fill in the blank. And then the last one was like Tommy Hilfiger. And nobody knew who Tommy Hilfiger was at the time, but all of a sudden he got put on the map. Right. And, one of the like Ralph Lauren came up to the ad guy later and was like, do you know how many it took me like 2 decades to like build that reputation? He's like, well, sounds like you did the wrong way, right? If you can just jump to the front of the line. So I do think that in sports, you sort of sportsmanship and doing it fairly and all these things, that there's sometimes in business where you do play a little dirty, or you do just sort of like say like, oh, wow, that gets you to the end result sooner. Uber was just like, we're going to ignore a bunch of laws, rack up the fees and renegotiate with the city once we're so popular that it would look bad for them to fine us that much. That's not something I would have ever thought of doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I have something, I'll share 2 things. I'm interested to know if you can diagnose me with something, but I'm interested to know if you have noticed any difference in founders that have played those different types of sports, like between side by side and like competitive face to face, like me against you. Only because there are some contexts in which I do see the difference, but actually in business, maybe not. So for example, I was just thinking of different examples just as you were talking. With running, it's quite funny. I started running this year, like casually. I did not run before. I can do sports that have sprinting, running very fast, but not running for a very long time. And I've not done that at all up until this year, just a few months ago. And so that's been new. And it's been good. It's been really incredible seeing my body adapt, even just within the first 3 runs or so. Some runs I did not think I could do, or I was not able to do at all. And I'm still not running very far, mind you. So it's not like I'm running a marathon anytime soon. But I think I did a few weeks ago, like just over 7K for the first time. And I was like, wow, it's pretty cool. It feels like some growth, some progress. But what is interesting is sometimes people say, oh, are you going to do a marathon? Are you going to join a run club? Something like that. And it's so strange to me that I have no idea. Like, there is zero interest anywhere in my body in doing that, because why would I go and join a run club if I'm not gonna win? Like, I wouldn't do it unless I knew I was gonna be in the first, whatever the first group or cohort of people, and not because, oh, I have to win, but just because, like, why would I do it so I could be like in the middle of the pack? You know, it sounds terrible when I say it, but I think that was genuinely the thought that was in my mind. Like, why would I could just do it by myself. There's no difference. It's different from maybe tennis, where it's like you have to play with other people in order to get better. You can't just do it by yourself. With running, I can just run by myself. When I know, like, I'm not going to sign up for a marathon until I know I can run a marathon. Like, I will have already done it before and got a good time. Then I will come and do it in public and get a good time. You know, why else? There's no other, it doesn't make sense to me any other way. So there's a sense in which, just as you made that distinction, it made me realize a connection there where I was like, oh, perhaps it's because I play competitive sports where it's like me against other people. Not that I am intentionally thinking that way, but maybe there is that connection there. But I do find that actually in business, I don't know if I always think like that. I've run a lot of the businesses that I've run that have not been like big startups have all been small businesses, and I've been quite happy with that. I remember I was interviewing for a role or something at one point, and someone asked me, like, they noted, oh, some of these businesses that you've run, they said something like, you know, but they'd failed or they didn't work or something like that. And I was like, no, they didn't. All of these businesses did just fine. Like, every single one of them, a few of them were six-figure businesses, but they all did exactly what I needed them to do. I had a travel business. I wanted to travel the world for free. That's exactly what I did. There was no, I wasn't trying to turn this. I mean, eventually I did try and pivot it to being a tech platform, and then the pandemic happened. So that didn't work out. But up until that point, this was just, I want to travel for free, and I'm going to organize some trips. People are going to go, you know, that was great for me. And then I ran like a coffee and wine business and things like that. That was more like social impact. So it was specifically because there was a story we were trying to tell about farmers in Africa. So we sold coffee from around Africa. And again, like, that's all I cared about. I don't care about, oh my gosh, this has to be, every time people kept asking me, am I going to raise money? Am I going to do? And I did a pitching competition thing, and people were like, oh, you know, you should speak to this investor. Like, I don't care. Like, I have zero interest in doing any of that stuff. So yeah, point being, it's interesting that actually in a business context, I don't think I've always had the mentality that every single thing I do has to be some rocket ship startup. I can do a business for fun. I just do it because I like doing it, or there is a goal, and as long as it achieves that thing, I don't really care about it doing anything else.
Did you have any engagement with the arts, like creative practices? Did you have any of those growing up or in your life now?
Yeah, mostly like now just writing, but I also did used to do
Of
some
course.
arts when I was younger as well.
What kind of arts?
I mean, not great art, but just like some painting and sketching. So I would draw a lot. I probably still have some sketchbooks somewhere down there. And also, I guess, design, because that was actually my first job. I self-taught design when I was like 13, 14. So then I would design stuff online, and then that would lead to making websites and stuff. And then now also photography. And funnily enough, just as I think about it, I would also say that these are things I have learned not to do for money anymore, because I did, and it sucked. And because anytime I do it, and unless I would just have to charge a lot. If I can't charge a lot and I'm charging even a reasonable amount, it would just feel like pain, because it's something I do for fun and I just enjoy doing it. It kind of perverts the thing that I'm trying to do.
It can be challenging to find that balance. Yes. I ask because I think sports is only one of the many lenses that we have in the things that we do, right? And of course, the more involved and engaged in like part of your life that was, the more that may shape how you think. I do think people do come in with natural temperaments of being more competitive and wanting to beat other people or not versus beating yourself or what have you. And I think what you talked about with your businesses feel more like creative pursuits, right? Like you have a vision for what you wanted to take a picture of or draw or what have you. And when you do that, you're satisfied, right? When you make the travel business allow you to travel around the world, you're satisfied, you know? Like I think it's not activating the sports part of your brain because it's just like it's more about the creative expression of your business skills. That's what I would say on that front as an amateur diagnosis, you know. And then on the running front, Yeah, I mean, there's something about this idea that, whenever you're in a group, maybe you are competing versus training together, right? And the idea that, like, hey, you don't have to be the best. And in fact, it's better to be in a group where you're not the best, because that's where you learn more, right? So there is a sense of there's like a performance culture, or like if I'm with others, I'm always performing, versus like this is a place for me to learn and grow and be okay with not being the best. Or maybe I go and then this helps me become better, and then I go somewhere else and I stunt on everybody. So I don't know. I think those are some things that like come to mind when I hear you describing what you've done. Yeah, or where your mind's at on those fronts.
Yeah, that's a useful diagnosis actually, and I think you're right because when I run by myself, it is more like art. I just do it for myself and I compete with myself, and that's fun by itself. If I was to go and do it in a different context with other people, then it would become this other thing. Now it's like either I'm gonna be good at it or I'm not gonna be good at it. Whereas by myself, I just try and beat my own times, and I enjoy that game a lot more. I don't want to turn that into there's no marathon, I'm not doing any of that stuff unless I've run several marathons by myself and I know that I can just do it. And then and then I will go and do it with other people.
Right, right. Yeah, I don't know what that is, because I mean, even with your various sports teams, I don't think were you the best player at all times on all the teams that you're a part of, or was
No,
that like your
probably
number one goal?
probably not.
Probably.
No, I said
Oh, but
probably
no,
not. But
yeah,
there was still I would want to be. Like I'd
yeah,
want to be
yeah.
like at my position among the best to the extent that I can, or at least I'll train
Of course,
with that intent.
it's fair, right? And I think some people really enjoy beating others. They need an opponent or a rival to kind of like egg them on. And as soon as that's gone, they're sort of not in it. And other people, that's not necessarily as motivating. I think of, so two examples: Michael Jordan, famously sort of like, and even Kobe too, and even Tom Brady, as he's talked more post retirement, they're fueled by resentment and being like, oh, and I took that personally. That like the whole joke was like everything is Michael Jordan taking things personally and then like wrecking somebody else, right? It's like, dude, I just said nice job, so that obviously worked for him, and also was a challenge for him in other ways. And then if you look at MMA, which is like clearly a fighting sport where you are literally trying to beat the other person in submission, I think of like one of the best fighters, George St. Pierre, a Canadian fighter. I read his memoir. I saw him in retirement. He loves the sport as a sort of like in the beauty of it. And he sort of doesn't love the competition of fighting. He loves training. He loves, he's still training, he's still learning, but he's just like, I don't need to keep fighting or come out of retirement to like beat somebody in particular. Like, sure, I'm sure he's had his rivalries, he's had his opponents, but it was more about like the art of being a martial artist, as it were. So obviously, you can do any sport and kind of have different mentalities that come out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just as you were saying that, I was trying to think of, how some of that applies to me. I would definitely say, as the caveat, I think I don't really care about beating other people. I don't care about whether you lose. I care about me not losing. Like yeah, I don't want to lose. I like, winning or just doing things well. If you do things well, you do things to a certain level, that's the most important thing. I don't really, whatever happens to you or to someone else, unless we're on the same team, I don't really think about that too much. I just think about us and what we're doing and whether we achieve the things that we want to achieve.
Yes. And to come back to the records thing that you asked me about, the world records, like I don't consider myself actually a very competitive person, although then it's like, well, what are you talking about? Like who goes and sets world records? But it's like, for me, it is like being the best I can be. If that ends up being the best in the world, awesome. It's more of like, I don't care that other people are worse. I just want to be the best, right? Like kind of what you're saying, right? It doesn't matter to me that I beat the previous record holder. I don't care about him at all. Like, good for you, like I just wanted to do this to do my best. And if my best is also the best in the world, like that's meaningful to me personally. It gives me something for my ego, especially I think the fact that I didn't get to compete in the finals gave me a lifelong desire to continue to prove my physical prowess in other ways. I did train and start running, and I did run a marathon, not very well, but, did it, like I compete in CrossFit, I challenge these world records. Like I had a CrossFit challenge in my gym where we were doing a bunch of push-ups every day. And at the end, it was like 8 minutes, as many push-ups as you could. And I was really frustrated because I worked out earlier in the week pretty hard and I was still not fully recovered from that. So when I'm doing it on that day, I was like, this is not my best. Come on. And I was really disappointed with my result, which was like 170 push-ups. And I was like, just gonna send this in, a little embarrassing. And then it turned out like the winner got 180. So I was like, not that far off. Yeah. Right. And now Max, I'm like, if I was on a fresh day, whatever, I probably could have done that. But, that's just me. Yes, I do want to win, but it's not about beating somebody. It's just like, I would have liked to do better for myself. And if that ends up beating everybody else, sweet, right?
Yeah. I want to get into some of your startup stuff, but I'll share one more story just from my side, just because it resonates with what you were sharing, and I think you'll understand. So probably the closest I've come to doing a marathon, and it's funny because when I tell people, they just assume that I was doing it as part of a group, like some organized thing. So one day, honestly, this is maybe just revealing how psychotic I am, but I was reading and people were like, "Oh, you should do 10,000 steps a day." And I have no idea exactly what the thought process was. But at one point I was just like, what if I did 100,000 steps? And then I tried to look. And
what?
Yeah, I tried to look online and see, okay, have people done this? And I found maybe 3 examples, like on Reddit or somewhere, where people had done it, but never consecutively. So I saw one person that had done it where they were doing like laps, and they would just do a certain number of laps through the day, but they were doing it in between doing other things. So as long as they came back out and did like another like 2 or 3 laps, then over time through the day, then it would accumulate to the 100,000 steps. And I saw one other person that did it, but they did it in different modes. So they would do it like some on a track, and then some walking like outdoors, and then some at the treadmill at the gym. So again, like lots of different modes. And I was like, oh, has no one just done this like nonstop? Just like you leave your house and you just do it and you come back. So I was like, okay, so that's what I'm going to do. So I kind of figured out a map, and the 100,000 steps is roughly like 81 kilometers. So it's basically like 2 back-to-back marathons, but walking.
50 miles.
Yeah, 50 miles. And
that's a lot.
It was not fun. It was probably one of the worst things that I've done. And I only gave myself 4 weeks to do it. I don't know. I just picked a day. And I think I'm also the kind of person where once the thought has entered my mind, I will just bully myself into doing it. Like I will know that if I back down, like nobody even knew at that point. Right. Like, but the thought has come into my mind, and I now know that I thought
that you walk around being like chicken.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's how it would feel. Like I thought about doing this, and I probably could have done it, and I just didn't. I decided not to do it. That would eat me up. So I said, I'm going to do this thing. I'll use it to raise some money for charity. But I was mostly just doing it because I wanted to do it. And I just did it, completely by myself. And it's so funny if it ever comes up and people are like, oh, is this part of some, big thing? And I was like, no, literally just by myself for almost 18 hours. just
David, we are on some spiritual level really connected, because I just feel that.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.